And there we go.
All right, fantastic. In that case, we can get started. Hey, everybody. Lovely to be here. Very excited to do this lecture for this very important cause. I'm very happy to be here. So what we're going to talk about today is about advanced characterization. And the tagline here is to do a little bit with a semi-pet peeve I have with the way that a lot of people approach characterization. So I guess that a good component of this will be addressed at how do we move beyond some of the more trite and rehearsed ways in which people rehearse characterization and try to go beyond that to add additional nuance and additional strength to the way in which we make those claims. Now, obvious disclaimers to give here are, no ideas under the sun are ever new, and I've learned everything that I've learned from a variety of people. There's, probably too many to credit, but I could not claim that anything I say is going to be particularly novel. I will, however, say that these are approaches that I have myself used and taught, and that I found them to be rather effective. So I can vouch for their efficacy, but perhaps not their originality, at least to the degree that nothing really is new under the sun. The second thing I did want to say is that if at any point you guys have questions, probably just best to shout them out, because I won't be able to see the chat while we're doing this, so that will make it a little difficult. Obviously, we'll have questions at the end as well, so I'm happy to answer stuff at the end as well. Last thing is that some things might reach a little bit beyond the remit of what we're going to discuss today. So I'll label those where they're the case, but I'll also label those in questions. However, I'll try my best to be as helpful as I can. Okay. And just to go over very quickly what we're going to discuss, firstly, we'll spend some time talking about some common issues with how people approach characterization. Then we'll talk a little bit about a good high-level approach to take to how we should try to confront characterization, how we would do it in different round contexts, and then trying to additionally make approaches for characterization that enable for us to be maximally nuanced and to be able to win rounds where there are nuanced questions of characterization that are going back and forth between different teams. Okay. So let's start with what I think are the common issues with how people characterize stuff. The first thing is, I think people will have a very big headline approach to characterization, which will basically go like, after they introduce the start of the speech, they'll be like, okay, here's some reasons why this thing will be done well, or here's reasons why we're going to do this thing strategically. So let's I think the first immediate problem that comes to mind with this approach, right, is that what does it even mean to communicate something or to do something well or to do something poorly, right? These are basically value judgment statements that are kind of vacuumous. They mean whatever you want them to mean. So let's take this motion, right? This supposes the narrative that suffering builds character. And so Opt tries to say this narrative will be communicated well. So people, therefore, will not take this to mean that they need to suffer in order to improve themselves. But what does it mean to communicate it well? Does it mean it will be communicated in a sufficiently harsh way that people don't internalize that message? Because that probably has some consequences of its own. Does it mean this will be communicated in an empathetic way? In that case, why is it that we could reconcile suffering and empathy? What does it mean to communicate it well, right? Like a first lesson already would just mean that we should be saying what we mean by communicating well. So for instance, in the case of this narrative motion and this argument, probably what it's trying to say is that we will communicate this narrative, or we will intend to communicate this narrative in a way that is empowering rather than one that puts people down. We see similar issues with when people try to make this sort of claim of we will do this thing strategically, whatever that actually means. Because what happens is that people basically try to use this as a debate cheat code. They try to use it to mean we will have all of the good instances and none of the bad ones, because people will do things strategically because they're smart. Ignoring the fact that smart people have oversights, constraints, and omissions all of the time. So let's take this motion, for example, right? This house would ban corporate residential landlords. This was, I think, the octo-final of Belgrade Worlds, and there's a pretty good recorded motion on it, recorded video on it. And the opening opposition team in that round starts out with the stance, which this is not going to be exactly the stance that they gave, because I'm trying to demonstrate the insufficiencies with taking this approach, versus I think the OO team in that round does a pretty reasonable job of this. So essentially what they say is that a big reason why we don't need to ban them is because regulators will crack down on these companies, and they're going to do it strategically. So because regulators obviously aren't God, they don't have power to tackle all of the companies, but cracking down on a few of them would set a chilling effect. But even that doesn't give us an answer to what does it mean to do it strategically. Is doing it strategically tackling the small ones so that they don't get cocky? Is it attacking the big ones so that there's a downstream chilling effect so that smaller deviators don't take the risk? Who actually knows at the end of this what it means for us to do it strategically? You're essentially just casting an assertion and asking for the judge to fill in the links for you. And the same burdens apply to whether you were going to make the full argument or whether you're just going to say you do it strategically. Like, why would you be able to do it strategically in the face of the constraints that you face? How is it that regulators will approach this in the face of their constraints? You can try, but it's not clear that you'll succeed, which is why just saying that you'll do it strategically doesn't seem to do much for you. That's additive. So therein, I think, lies our first two big problems with the status quo approach. The first one is that it's excessively generic, right? It doesn't seem to acutely adapt to different round contexts in a way that would actually help for us to resolve their core characterization questions. And so oftentimes it can just end up being a waste of time. Secondly, it doesn't seem to acutely resolve the question that this characterization is trying to address. So for instance, in the landlord's motion, the characterization question here basically is, obviously, corporate residential landlords have a significant amount of power over their tenants. They can, raise their rent on them. They can not take care of the apartments. They can do whatever they want. So how is it that we avoid their most abusive practices? And how is it that we're able to basically hold them back and stop their worst case abuses? Now, the answer we're getting seemingly from this example here is that we'll try to regulate them. But you can see from that it would need to be way more specific to answer the question of how would we go about trying to regulate them? Why would those attempts be successful? And then why does that mean that we can avoid the worst case instances of where it is that corporate residential landlords will go wrong so that then OP can mitigate the prop harms and claim their own benefits? The last problem that happens oftentimes in a lot of ways that people characterize right now is that they'll very much stop at first order claims in favor of what they're trying to say. By which I mean, what they'll do is that they'll make a claim of characterization in their favor, but not one that seems to be sufficient and not one that seems to stand up to much challenge. So let's take this motion that we were talking about earlier where it came to doing things well. This motion, this house opposes the narrative that suffering builds character. Now, opposition might stand up and say that this narrative will be understood not to mean that suffering is always good for you and that we should pursue suffering. And the reason that people don't understand it that way is because people contextualize this narrative with their existing understanding and experience of suffering. They've had sad memories in their lives of when they've lost someone they love. They've had struggles with different things that they face. And so they're obviously not going to understand it in a way that would lead them to believe that we should pursue suffering for character growth. That's obviously a fair argument to make. It's reasonable. But the problem is that it's somewhat limited, right? Because we can say that this narrative would be communicated in this sensitive and non-harmful way for one reason, but it's not clear that that one reason is sufficient to mean that it would be done effectively. And to be clear, by sufficient here, I don't mean that you should just add in more reasons to make it more robust. What I mean is that in order for something to be sufficient, it would need to overcome the constraints working against its persuasiveness. So if I were to say that the reason why this narrative would be communicated badly is because people have like these short-termist incentives, or people tend to have like a harm-averse response to when things are painful, then a reason for why something would be done well would need to show why that effective thing, that good thing, overpowers the negative things. That's what I mean by sufficiency. And so, given that there's reasons to suggest that something will be done poorly, why does this first order claim that something would be done well overpower the claim that it would be done poorly? So that's the other problem people have, is that in failing to consider sufficiency, oftentimes people would just stop at first order claims, which ends up making things not particularly robust, very easy to challenge, and ends up putting you in a position where it's very easy for these arguments to be disputed and for your characterization to not last very long in the round, and for good teams to be able to basically beat you by outfoxing you and by realizing what you were going to characterize and taking it out. Because it's worth realizing that like most decent to good teams will have both encountered similar motions to you, but also would have considered characterization in a very similar way to you. And so that means that they will also be anticipating and preempting what you're going to say. So they would be able to build characterization that is resilient for what you might say in this instance, which is why this ends up being a bit of a problem. So these are some of the problems that I think exist in the way that people characterize right now, which I think leads us to suggest that we should maybe think about different ways in which we should approach characterization, and a way to do so that might be more robust, stronger, harder to take down, and adds in more nuance in situations where otherwise arguments might be challenging to make in a nuanced manner. So in order to establish that, I think it's first worth going over what exactly is characterization, right? Like, it's a little bit broad as an idea. And I think that people oftentimes, like, debaters and debate educators are very guilty of conflating a bunch of terms together, like framing and characterization and illustration. And obviously these things have conceptual overlap with one another, but I think it is worth being quite explicit in distinguishing what is characterization. In essence, characterization refers to descriptive claims that help us to set up the context for a debate in some kind of meaningful form. There's a few different ways in which that might happen. The first thing is a descriptive claim about an actor. So what is it that people do? How do groups of people interact? So, when a retail investor sees a stock go down, how do they respond to that? It's their fear in that. And that's what leads to them selling, even though it would be an irrational decision. That's a characterization claim because it's descriptive about a group of people, the way that they behave, and the action that leads to. The second thing we can have is claims about the world. For instance, where we describe things that are happening and the way that changes the relative evaluation of all involved. So for example, let's say we were to take the motion, I don't know, like this house supports, this house supports CEOs stepping down at the point of IPO when a company goes public. And you might say that we currently live in a time where IPO is becoming increasingly difficult. Market conditions are very uncertain and volatile. What that means for both sides of the debate is that for prop, it ends up meaning that these CEOs will oftentimes, it's a good idea for them, potentially, because it means that they will no longer need to occupy themselves with the difficulties of a newly public company. But for opposition, it means that they can mobilize the fact that it's an uncertain time, uncertain conditions. And so this is where having somebody with even a marginally better understanding of the business can be very, very important. So the world around the motion will also make a difference there. The last thing is claims about the debate. So where we point out the context within which each side operates. So let's take this motion, right? Let's take the motion. This house supports the US building preemptive military capacities, like building foreign armed bases all over the world, posting out aircraft carriers to different regions, that kind of thing. So what you might say is, we live in a world, like prop, you might point out on prop that on opposition rather, that prop needs to operate within a context where people are increasingly wary toward foreign intervention. They have seen lots of money go toward interventions that have failed, like Vietnam, like Iraq, like Syria. They've seen money go there that has ultimately been fruitless. And there are politicians on both sides of the political aisle in the United States, for example, who are very reticent and unwilling to see more foreign intervention. There are foreign policy hawks both within the Democrat and Republican Party. Similarly, you might say op needs to operate within a context where the world is becoming increasingly bipolar in terms of the powers that be, that there's a growing non-Western bloc of countries like China, Russia, Iran, Brazil, etc. And so what you might say as a result of that is that because this is the context in which the world is happening, that is one in which preemptive military capacities would be more and more important if the United States wants to preserve its ability to project power. So you can see here that basically what we're talking about in characterization is descriptive claims and context claims that we can then use in a variety of different strategic ways or would have different analytical purposes.
Yeah. So
where are some of the places where characterization kind of lacks?
Just tracking around spending time.
The first thing to think about is just thinking about emotion more.
I think I'll try and keep doing it, but I think I'll make it more of a daily process.
Omar, I think you're muted unmuted right now.
Because I think right now, like I'm looking at emails on my calendar, just trying to see where I spend time.
Exactly.
And
I'll shoot him a message just because I think he doesn't realize that he's unmuted. Okay, I think it's fine now. All right, so yeah. So I think the first thing to consider is thinking about motions in a broader sense. So let's go through two different examples of motion types for where it is that motion, thinking about motions guided by characterization can immediately start to help out our prep process. So for instance, in a lot of analysis motions, it might be worth thinking about what are the common implementations of the thing that we're talking about. So maybe the motion is going to be something along the lines of, this house opposes the expansion of private equity into the healthcare sector. And you might think, what are the common instances of this happening? It might be the expansion of private equity into US nursing homes and the harms that we've seen downstream of this that you can use as a common implementation of this. Because it helps for us to set up that this is the context of what's happening right now that leads to there being a certain problem that we need to solve. So the context tells us of basically a potential source of arguments already. Secondly, we can think about each operative term of the motion. Because if there's a question mark as to what the thing we're talking about is, or if there's an internal debate as to how the thing in question will manifest, then that is immediately grounds for characterization. It is a place where you should characterize because it will help you, and a place where if you don't characterize, you are likely to be punished because you're basically giving free license to the other side to characterize things in a way that would favor them. So let's take this motion. This was one of the EFL final suggestions for UADC this year. It goes, this house, as a sectarian minority leader in an authoritarian Islamic state, would actively encourage their followers to conceal their religious identity even when not under duress. So this is people like Shias, Ahmadis, kind of that kind of thing. So we can see that there's a bunch of different operative terms in this motion that give us question marks as to what is the thing that we're discussing here, or is there a debate as to how this thing will manifest? Let's just go through a few of them, right? Like, what are these sectarian minorities like? What is life like as a Shia in like a Sunni majority country? What is life as an Ahmadi in like Bangladesh or Pakistan? How does the leader of such a group think and confront a variety of issues? What are that leader's priorities when they're looking out for their community? What does an authoritarian Islamic state look like? It's often unclear. There's lots of different manifestations of it. Is it like Algeria or is it like Saudi Arabia? Both very different types of governments, but both Islamic and both having some authoritarian tendencies. What is active encouragement on behalf of the religious institution? What would that look like? And what is concealing? What are the actions that we're actually endorsing under the motion for you to take in the process of concealing? Now, a lot of these things would basically be a process of illustration. A lot of these would be thinking about each of these as a different variable that we would want to basically construct an idea of in our heads. But what we're doing with thinking about each operative term is making sure that we're identifying where a debate lies, and then we're addressing what are the issues that would fall underneath that debate in order to make sure that we can win it. So that we're realizing what actually are the things that are contentious and where is it that our understandings of the motion and the world in which it operates might differ. And we can see this in policy motions as well, right? Like, for example, what are different contexts in which a policy may have been tried out? Or like, what are the differences in how a motion would function in different contexts? So let's take the motion, this house would implement a financial transaction tax, like a Tobin tax. It's probably true that in the United States, for example, this will lead to higher tax revenues and reducing speculative trading and arbitrage, because the US market is such an important one to the broader world. It's used for so many foreign transactions and for sourcing so much investment that you wouldn't really be able to source meaningful alternatives. There's too much capital in the US, so people will have to comply with the tax, and as such, you'll end up with a lot of tax revenues. Or that it would then, because there are no alternatives, lead to it being enforced, and as such, you're able to reduce market volatility from short-term trade disincentivizing through the Tobin tax. But it's also probably true that in less attractive markets, like in the Netherlands or in the UK, this will just lead to a net reduction in market activity, because there are some benefits to you trading in these places, but there's also significant costs. It's not the US, there's there's heavier regulations. But this is something that might swing the pendulum of the costs being too much and them overwhelming and overriding the benefits that are being achieved. And so we can see that the motion functions quite differently in different contexts. And we can think about what those potential contexts are out of prep in order to be able to identify where is it that this motion will lie? What are the different contexts in which our arguments might apply? And what are the different contexts that we need to address? Now, this might seem like quite stock advice at this point, right? But like even on policy motions, many people fall short by subconsciously thinking about the motion as if it has one operative context, usually the context of the illustration they can most easily think of, and then not going into depth on trying to address where those things might differ, where those things might fall short, or what are the other situations in which this motion might manifest as well. So I think that even this relatively stock advice does matter quite a lot, and I think that you would benefit from implementing it. And here's, I think, the bottom line that I want to stress in this sort of part of the lecture. Don't run away from characterizing. A lot of people will realize that there's something contentious in what they're saying in the prep room or in when they're building out an argument. They'll realize that when they're saying this will manifest in X way, that concealing would mean that you are not going to say that you are of that religious group, that might be contested by the other side. The other side might be say, oh yeah, you'll say that you're a Shia, but you won't, for example, try to like take a days off of work during Muharram. Like they might say that on opposition, and you would need to challenge that claim. Oftentimes people will realize that these disputes will happen, but they just ignore them. They're just like, oh yeah, it's fine. We'll just say ours with enough force. But that's not enough, right? That doesn't set you up well to be able to win the round. That doesn't set you up well to have a robust and nuanced characterization. So when you realize that those characterization situations are coming, address them. Address them head on. Don't run away from them because it will bite you in the back. Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about was about characterization-based arguing. So essentially, we'll go through this whole big slide in a moment. Oftentimes, the other place where people lack characterization is in identifying characterization as a burden within their arguments. So I'm going to go through this two different examples of the same argument being proven and highlight where it is that there are characterization burdens within this argument, and also where there might be approach differences that you might want to make in how you approach building these arguments. Let's take this motion. This is another one of the three potential motions for the EFL final EUDC this year. This house prefers a world where all major religions did not obligate their followers to go on religious pilgrimages. The argument that we'll make here is that religious pilgrimage is more meaningful on prop. I want to start with this first approach on the left-hand side, which is basically what I'll call the mechanistically driven approach. This is the approach that a lot of people, I would even say the majority of people, take toward building or arguing something. So what they will often say is, okay, here's the premise, 3 reasons why. They might say, here's the 3 reasons why religious pilgrimage is more meaningful on prop. 1, it's more unique to you. 2, it's more self-motivated, so you feel responsible for being closer to God. 3, it's not as prescriptive, so people try to discover pilgrimages that are more unique and distinctive. So we can immediately see the problem here, right? When we say it's more unique to you, it's not clear how and why is it more unique to you, or what makes it meaningful for you to have a more unique pilgrimage than other people. And so characterization about how people think about and internalize pilgrimage is already necessary in order for the first mechanism of this argument to work. And similarly, on the third mechanism of like people trying to discover more differentiated pilgrimages, that just kind of feels like a throwaway. It's not clear what makes that more meaningful. It's not clear what that's so valuable about that. And underlying all of this, whenever I'm saying this argument, there seems to be an underlying question that you should have in your head as a judge, which is, what does it even mean for a religious pilgrimage to be more meaningful? What is the marginal value of a slightly more meaningful pilgrimage to a religious believer? Now, I think that what this does is it highlights some of the problems where it comes to basically trying to argue on a burden-based approach. I think that what that often is not burden-based, but a mechanism-based approach, because there's oftentimes burdens, and specifically characterization-related burdens, that are hard to see and become more convoluted in trying to address them. And we can see that there's a big, big question of characterization, of why this argument is of any relevance at all, that seems to just be missing when we try to take a mechanistic approach to building this argument out. I'm now going to go through a burden-based approach of making the same argument, where basically we list out what are the necessary burdens for the argument to be true, and we go through trying to say what the argument would be. So we might say, okay, the problem in status quo is that religious pilgrimage often feels burdensome when it's obligatory on a religious believer. Now, here's where we get our first question on characterization. Why would it be burdensome? Is this more burdensome or less burdensome than other religious duties? Why do people feel this way? But that's our problem. Now, the second burden is, how do we solve that problem? We can say people are more motivated by self-sought pilgrimages and find them more meaningful. Why? Firstly, because it's more of a unique experience. But then we have a question of what makes it more unique. How is it more unique? And how is this unique in a way that matters to people? Or secondly, it feels more self-motivated, leading to a religious feeling of connection between you and God. And the question is, what is the difference between the connection that you feel without this pilgrimage and with this pilgrimage? Now, what this immediately suggests to us is that, the characterization-driven argument building will often unlock burdens that we don't foresee, like this one. And so that's why I would strongly advocate for trying to run arguments in a burden-driven way. And that characterization-driven argument building will help us to understand what are the things that we need to prove in additional detail to make them very difficult to contest. So
I got a
here,
question before we move to
yeah,
the
sure,
next
hit
one.
me. Yeah, sure, hit me.
Yeah, so in the sectarian motion, you mentioned that we should also characterize how this concealing would look like. My question is,
Yeah.
how do I give really good model of concealing? And can this model be think of as an characterization?
So I think because that's an analysis motion, it wouldn't be explicitly called a model. But it is true that, if you are a prop, for example, and at first prop you get up and set it up in a certain way, then oftentimes that adds a level of credibility that makes it difficult to contest you. In terms of how you would do it, we'll talk about that more later on. But I think basically it just relies on you being quite illustrative in a way that's quite clear as to what exactly you're accomplishing. So if, for example, we're talking about concealing, I might say, look, essentially what we're trying to do here is for you to not be discovered. What this motion is asking us to do is for people within this community to not be able to be identified as that community and for them to blend in with the majority. What does that look like? It means they don't talk about religion at work, for example. They answer questions when they're prompted, but they don't proactively bring up their religious faith. They don't invite their friends over for religious gatherings and invite to pray with them. They will answer questions when asked, but they'll try to give minimal detail. We're not saying that you have to lie about your religion. We're not saying that you should claim to be a different religion, but we're saying that you should try to make it something that's closely held to you in a way that means that people will probably not ask very much. Now, the immediate question within this characterization is, why will this even work? Because won't people just interrogate you to the point of revealing your religion? Now, the answer you would give to that, I think, is to say, and I think this should come within the explanation of the characterization, you shouldn't wait till you're challenged, is you would say something along the lines of, remember, we're talking about a context which is not one of duress, which means that sure, people care about religion in a religious society, but not to the degree that they're trying to actively find people of a different faith or sect to persecute them. And similarly, people oftentimes feel uncomfortable probing others about deep and personal details, especially where they don't feel as if they're giving it up. So if I ask you about what your parents are like and you give like a 1-word or 2-word answer, I will probably think, okay, this person doesn't want to tell me more, and I'll naturally back off because I don't want to be intrusive. So what this approach is doing is it's playing people's own personal biases in such a way that makes it very difficult for them to push further and allows for them to conceal the crucial tenets of their religious faith. So I think that's the way I would go about trying to characterize that.
Yeah, I have one last question. You mentioned two things,
sure.
right? Specifically. First one is workplace. Second thing is not inviting different religious people from other communities, right? So to safeguard them. My question is, when do I know that this is the point I should stop characterizing this and this is enough? Like in specific, when I'm in a competitive round, right? It sometimes happens is that I missed a specific crucial characterization that closing comes and try to give, right? So when can I particularly understand that, okay, as much as I have characterized, this is enough?
I think essentially what you need to do is you need to be asking yourself the question of how strategic is it for the other side to challenge this characterization? So for example, I think in this instance, what I would say is it probably doesn't make a ton of sense for opposition to be challenging. What does it mean for people to conceal, as opposed to them to challenge the idea of How will the religious community respond to being told to conceal their identity? Do they respond positively or negatively? How does this lead to the general upkeep or health of that religious sect? Those seem to be the bigger, more important questions of the round. And I think that thinking about how much the other side would contest these things based off of what are the arguments that are useful and favorable for them to run, I think will help for you to see which are the things that you might want to give relatively minimal characterization on, that you get like 1 or 2 illustrations, versus things that you would want to go into quite a lot of depth on. And you should apportion your time according to what you think is more or less likely to be challenged. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Great, no worries. So here's an example of where I've tried to build out the same argument with the same burden-based approach as before, but try to fill in some of those characterization burdens. So let's, we go to the same problem, right? Religious pilgrimage often feels burdensome when it's obligatory. Why is that the case? Which is the first characterization question that we didn't answer earlier. Because it is financially challenging to travel far. The Hajj is very expensive for a lot of Muslims. A lot of Jews would not be able to travel to the Holy Land during their lifetimes. Some are, but very many aren't. And that leads you having a feeling of exclusion when you see others around you do it in your lifetime, and you don't get to do it, which makes you feel more excluded and less as if you can be connected. You feel like you've lapsed on a component of your duties to God. And so that means that it can feel like a burden on you when you're failing to complete it. So what changes in the world? What we can start by saying is that people, when they're not obligated, obviously will still face constraints. It's expensive, it's out of your way. As such, the question then becomes, when are people making the choice to do a pilgrimage? And who are the people who would make that active choice? What we can say then is that people who would make this choice are those who feel a very strong pull towards religion, like a divine calling to go toward a certain place, or a yearning to connect further with their religion where they feel like they become detached on it, and they want to take some kind of tangible action to try to cleanse themselves or to try to learn more and dive deeper into their religion. And so then we can go, based off that then, what does make this pilgrimage more meaningful? Same mechanisms as before. Firstly, uniqueness. People compare their experiences to others to derive value. We want to feel special and chosen. When we seek a connection to God in a way and form that no one else does, it makes it feel more unique to you. And so here you can see that we've characterized what is it about uniqueness that matters to people that then means that this is important to people when they do it. And secondly, we can say it feels more self-motivated. You have a feeling of connection between you and God. And here we go. Like, here's that characterization that we can add underneath that to make it seem more like that connection matters. Often religious believers feel as if their relationship with God is a prescriptive one. They go to church because their parents told them to. They pray because it's written in the scripture. If you're a Christian, you fast during Lent because that's what the example of Jesus says. But these are never things that are self-driven. They are scripturally driven. When there is a self-induced action, that still feels like it's scripturally significant because you've read the prophets of an Abrahamic religion do pilgrimage. You've seen the pilgrimage of the Buddha. That means that feels powerful to you. That motivates your religious belief further because it's something that you did in order to get closer to God. I want to draw attention toward one part of the result of how we've built this argument out with characterization, which is that we've narrowed the argument a little bit, right? You look at this bit in the middle where we say there's a group of people who would be focused on doing this. And we are narrowing compared to what opposition is saying. Because opposition is saying that everybody does pilgrimages or everybody feels pushed to do it. And as such, they will have all of the benefits of that, but that they also need to deal with the burden that many people will find obligatory and many people will be left out. We are instead conceding that, sure, not everyone's going to go on pilgrimages. There are challenges in doing so. But there is a group for whom it is very powerful and very transformative in a way that only we are able to unlock. So again, you can see that there's additional components of useful strategy that can be unlocked by us trying to think through arguments in a robust and characterization-driven way. That, I think, brings us on to what I think is the first constructive conclusion about how to approach characterization, which is in a burden-based approach to characterization, to argument building rather, there will often be burdens of characterization, things that need to be answered about the world, things that need to be answered about how people think in order for the argument to operate. And that is something that we should then be trying to address. So these might be questions about the world in which the motion operates. So is pilgrimage easy to access or hard to access? And we need to answer that. because that's obviously contestable, but we would want it to lean in our favor. And there's obviously questions about how the group of people on whom the motion operates acts as well. So is there a lack of meaning in how religious believers in status quo perceive pilgrimage like the Hajj? Do they perceive it as enlightening, or do they perceive it as burdensome? Question, not clear what the answer is. And so you can see that these things are best spotted as questions about the world in which the motion operates, or questions about the group of people under whom the argument operates. So identifying these contestable premises involved will help us to point out where to characterize as well. And not to beat a dead horse at this point, but that conclusion 1.5 I'll add is that burden-driven argument approaches are often way better at being cleaner to follow and making the characterization burdens way more obvious, so that then we know where they are and we know how to answer for them. So I would strongly recommend for people to approach building arguments in terms of their burdens. Okay, next, let's talk a little bit about world building. So this is the second thing I would suggest in terms of just tangible advice. How should people approach characterization? And this is the second thing you should do. You should try to world build about how the motion operates in prep time before you get into arguments, sort of in the first minute or two. And I think the important thing about it is that people oftentimes already do this, but in a way that's not very explicit. So people will have a world under which the motion operates in their head, but they don't go about the process of making that particularly explicit in a way that would enable them to really get the best out of it. So for instance, let's take the motion, this House prefers a world where the executive branch of government, so senior ministers, for example, were only appointed out of the pool of elected politicians. This was, I think, round 2 of the Vienna IB. Now, a person could think, presumably, this motion is about the things that change in democratic governments. But it could also be about hybrid regimes, where sure, there's democracy, but there's also corruption and that type of thing. And you have in your head an underlying sort of vision of, it happens in hybrid regimes, so therefore I'm going to run an argument about corruption. And I'll start out by talking about corruption without making it explicit about how relevant this motion is in hybrid regimes. So your characterization will sort of be underlying, or that you could probably figure it out by reading between the lines. But this isn't enough. Why is it not enough? Number one, because you hold back on how much you can mobilize that characterization in your favor. So going back to the same motion, right? If this is about corrupt regimes, and you are making arguments about how, for example, this is a good policy or this is a good world because it constrains the ability for us to have the worst possible appointments. You don't have the minister's wife being appointed as you don't have the prime minister's wife being appointed as a senior minister in the government. If that is the argument you're making, you're holding back your ability to push hard on opposition, how damaging those contexts are. How in those contexts, many awful situations are happening on opposition, which you're avoiding on your side, of people who are wholly unqualified getting into power because of patronage, versus on your side, they would be people who are still partially qualified and are able to do a better job. So you can see that you have a useful piece of offense that you're not able to suitably mobilize because you aren't explicitly justifying the underlying view of the world that you have. Secondly, you undermine its persuasive strength as well. Because if you want to sell an argument that's relevant to one particular context, you would need to sell or suggest why it would be a dominant or important context. Because without justifying it, it can easily be minimized, right? You can be like, oh, this number of countries where there's this level of corruption are not that many. And in those situations, there will be corruption anyways. You can mitigate it in a bunch of ways unless you sell the fact the context is a really relevant one. But the last thing is, a team could capitalize and contest this if they spot what you're doing. So for example, let's take that same example we're using again, where you basically make the argument on prop that corruption is going to be mitigated because you aren't just able to appoint entirely unqualified ministers. Opposition could point out that in such contexts and countries, things like mafiosos could win political office. Like in Brazil right now, the First Capital Command, one of the biggest cartels, is appointing officers and bribing them to the point where they're functionally fielding candidates for political office and for mayoral elections. And they're also themselves running waste and water services. So clearly, in these contexts, even when we allow for appointments that would only be out of the pool of elected politicians, even the elected politicians could be captured, so it doesn't make a significant difference. So clearly, just having it being underlying between the lines is not enough, because that leads us to be vulnerable in a variety of different ways. So we need to make sure that we're explicitly justifying and talking through our world building when we characterize the motion in a broad sense. So like I mentioned already, I do think that many people will have in their heads a view of the way in which it will work. But let's say that you don't have that view in your head about how this would work. How is it that you should go about attempting to justify this type of thing? Okay, it seems as if the room that I've been using may be also booked up. So give me a moment. I'm going to try to move around to somewhere else. Give me a moment. Okay, we're back and rolling. Very good. So we should just be able to go from where we left off. Let me just get the slide back. Yeah, great. All right. So how do you go about it? How do you go about world building through being able to say what it is that you think the world looks like? Now, like I mentioned before, I think that to some degree, a lot of people already have a vision in their heads of how this kind of thing works. They'll have an underlying vision, and I think that you should just be saying that out loud. So you should be saying, what is you should be answering the specific question of what is the context under which this argument operates? What are the situations in which this argument is happening? Like almost imagine it as if you're saying context as a box to fill when you get into the explanation of an argument. But let's say you can't come up with one. Let's say that you are kind of lost as to what that context of an argument is. I think there's a couple of ways that you can go about trying to generate it. The first thing I would say is to, well, I think essentially the approach to take is to start with an analogy for the motion and to work your way backwards through that analogy in order to demonstrate a context under which that motion might happen. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do this firstly as an analogy of the motion, and then secondly as an analogy of a situation similar to the motion. So let's start with an analogy of the motion, right? So let's take the motion. This house would ban private equity firms from investing into critical industries like healthcare. There, we can just take an easy analogy of an instance of private equity going through abusive behaviors. So we can say, look at private equity's effect on US nursing homes. A working paper by the Biden administration found that PE ownership in nursing homes increased excess mortality by about 11%, which is the equivalent of about 1,000 unnecessary deaths per year. And we can say that that analogy works for the problem of the motion in general, that private equity takes significant stakes in businesses, makes cuts, and then the people who are around that business or depend on that business suffer, while the owners of that business are able to make profit. So we can say that the world is not one where PE is well regulated or understood. It is one where PE has outsized capital influence and is able to do significant damage to people's lives. So you can see that being able to go through that analogy helps for us to set up a context of how it is that PE generally behaves. Even if it's not 100% one-to-one true of all of the different examples of how PE acts in critical industries, maybe it's the case that there's like PE in the telecommunications industry that's been able to bring in lots of capital investment to build out like telephone masts and stuff. But there's one analogy for us to use to show a set of characterization or set of contexts that seems to be true and seems to matter quite a bit in terms of its impact. And then we can try to justify ourselves why is it that would be an overwhelming or more frequent set of situations. The other thing we can do is an analogy of a similar situation to emotion if we don't really know what it is, right? Like a simple example of this that people often use is in very elementary debate teaching is just like in any given ban motion, you would go, okay, what are things that we already ban or restrict the use of, and how would we go about doing it? So if you were to say that we're gonna ban like single-use plastics, we could go, okay, how is it that we ban stuff right now? If we ban Class A drugs, we prevent their distribution, we cut off people and try to criminalize people who try to produce those things, and we just make them unavailable from the general market. So we can just use that as an analogy. But I think that this works in even more complex situations to analogize characterization. So let's take the motion, this house opposes the rise of private credit. You might not be like an expert on private credit, but you might have a vague idea of what private credit is. And you might be able to think about it by analogy of some of the things that were common in private equity with private credit. So maybe you'd say, much like private equity in its initial phases, private credit is not well understood. There are low regulatory and transparency requirements on it. You don't need to report on the conditions of the loans that you're giving out as a private credit fund. You don't need to report on the liquidity ratio of the debtors, as in how much money they have compared to how much debt they have. Oftentimes, you will have higher priority on credit priority schemes than banks will. So it means that if you go bankrupt, you'll get your money back first. So there's a lot of abuse happening without there being a clear picture of how it's happening. So much like private equity in the 90s and early 2000s, this is poorly understood, but is slowly taking more and more of the market in a way that we can see as quite dangerous and having unforeseen consequences in ways that we are struggling to anticipate. So even if we don't know a ton about private credit, we can go, okay, we can take an example of here's the last time we had a financial instrument broadly applied across the economy that is new and that we don't fully understand, and use that to try to make the claim. Now, within this, I would say beware of pigeonholing. Like, not all situations will cleanly apply, and many of these will also narrow you on the number of contexts that you're in. So try not to pigeonhole yourself too much. And a good way to avoid that pigeonholing is to ask yourself, what is the inverse of this situation? What is the inverse of this characterization that is also worth thinking of? So in the private equity example, you can go, what are instances where private equity could be positive? It's instances where there's something that is good for society, but is very unprofitable, and so it needs a capital injection in order to be able to keep it alive such that it can make a profit and survive. So maybe it's the case that, you know, airlines that are connecting rural areas who are flying unprofitable routes would need some extra profit to be able to buy wide bodies so that then they can fly more passengers and make more profit per passenger. But they can't do that without private equity being able to introduce that capital to the business. So you can think inverse as well. What is the inverse of the situation that can allow for us to make sure that we're building a well-rounded characterization, and one where we can show that the set of contexts we're talking about is more likely or more dominant than the ones that the other side might try to use in their favor. The next thing to consider where it comes to constructive approaches to characterization, of it's like the things that we would actually do, are to think about how it is that we should approach actor building. The first thing to think here is just like, how is it that people think, right? This should always be the baseline premise that we use to try to build out how is it that people respond to stuff. And there's obviously a variety of things and biases that operate on people's psychology that affect the way in which they act. So people oftentimes have groupthink, where if people around you think one way, you start to doubt yourself and think that you might be wrong and to try to align with them because you want social validation. There's a variety of cognitive biases that exist. People are risk averse. They don't want to lose things, and they would rather not lose things than gain them in many instances. People have a status quo bias where they think that the way that things are is either the best or only way. People tend to think that, people tend to have like an intelligence bias where they think that they are basically above average in things, particularly where it comes to intelligence, even though obviously definitionally not everybody can be above average. So people have a variety of cognitive biases in the way they think about themselves and the world. People have social groups that affect the way that they think. If you are in a right-wing echo chamber, if you are grown up religious, if you are at a university, or are in like a more leftist space, those things would all affect the way in which you think. People have their self-contained narratives. People want to be good people. People want to be validated. People want to be loved and seen as beautiful and seen as the heroes of their own life story. So people have a variety of self-contained narratives as well that affect the way in which they think. So that's worth identifying as well, because that would help for us to be able to picture how it is that people respond to certain situations and to characterize why that response is likely to happen in a way that's really robust. But the other thing I want to say about this is that it's important to remember that people are not just acting in a certain way, and that the motion is not the only influence on people's actions, and that they would act in a certain way. A lot of debaters, what they will do is they'll basically, what I think will have what I call like motion tunnel vision, where they envisage the people that they speak about in motions, almost like they're like puppets, like they're like basically like the motion is a little like simulacrum of reality that we created to test out an idea. And so people's context in the motion is only the things that are happening within the motion itself. And so it's important to remember that people will have a broader calculus of the things that they consider way outside of the motion when they are thinking about things and making decisions. I do think that people understand this in certain motion types, and I want to call out what those are, because I think that it'll help to understand how it is that we should probably make approaches more generally where it comes to characterizing how people act. So a common instance where people do understand the idea that people aren't just limited to the motion is any motion where people make an argument about voting behavior. Because people seem to understand that if, like A or B thing might change in the world, but those things aren't necessarily electorally determinative. People will have a bunch of electoral priorities. Maybe they're voting to do with immigration. Maybe they're voting to do with the economy. But these aren't the things that would swing their vote. Or they might be important to them, but not important enough that they would vote on that issue. And as such, even if this thing exists, it is not enough to change voting behavior or for there to be any arguments about how governments would change their actions based off of a voting incentive. So that's one example of where we can say people are not just functions of the motion. There's factors outside of the motion that are also affecting their decision making. And crucially, what that means in terms of argument burdens is we would need to say why it is that whatever the variable we're talking about is, would be powerful enough to overcome people's existing, like sort of pre-existing disposition where it comes to the way in which they would vote, and thus can be an electorally determined issue. Similarly with narrative motions, where there's a narrative telling people to be more selfless in the world, that might exist in a world where people already have pre-existing incentives to be selfish. So then the question becomes, why would the narrative overpower their pre-existing incentives to be selfish? And then that is how we could say there's a broader calculus of their decisions, like, the broader other narratives that exist in the world or within their lives that would change the way that they would think before the motion is acting on them. Similarly with IR motions, like we point out the fact that actors usually will not just have one objective. Like, a country like Malaysia obviously cares a lot about their relationship with China, but they also care about their broader relationships in the region. They care about their ability to secure fishing rights for themselves. They care about their ability to project power on a global stage to some degree as well. So the fact that there isn't just one objective helps for us to be able to see, okay, within this broader picture of objectives, how does the thing that we're talking about within the motion, how does, for example, trying to sign a code of conduct on the use of the South China Sea fit into what Malaysia's broader interests are? And similarly with that is religion motions, where people will often talk about the fact that like, religious people have like one incentive, which is to go to heaven, and they desire salvation. Obviously that's true, but religious believers have material desires as well. They aren't immune from those things. And that's why a lot of religious people don't always follow their religion 100% to its entirety. That's why a lot of religious people have sex before marriage. Like, these things don't always deviate from one another, but they also don't always overlap. So you would need to make claims for why it is that then whatever incentive you're talking about within the religious narrative or the religious scripture would be enough to overpower your material calculus as well. So those are just a few examples to work through to show how it is that we should think about constructing actor analysis, and that we should have a broader vision in mind of how the people we're talking about are behaving. So I would go, like, for example, like if there's a group of people and claim they're influenced by emotion, I would go, here's a group of people. There's obviously this motion, but then there's a bunch of other stuff that they care about as well. In light of all of those things together, then, why is it still the case that what we're claiming is going to happen and the change that we're claiming would occur? The next thing to think about is nuance, and building nuance into where we characterize. This is where we go from basically just like thinking about big ideas of how should we approach constructing characterization into how do we construct really good characterization. Essentially, where are the places where we might need nuance, where nuance might be very useful for us? Nuance might be very useful, firstly, when we think about the fact that people would behave in different ways. So there's competing characterizations about the way in which they would behave. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't just like directly competing incentive claims, because your characterization should be resolving that. So for example, in a narrative motion, like again, let's go back to the narrative from before, like this house, what was it, like this house opposes the narrative that suffering is character building. In that, there's obviously like the incentive, the competing incentives of, you know, some people want to communicate this in a way that's positive for people, and some people want to communicate it like to self-soothe people after they're traumatized, versus some people want to communicate this in a way that says that you need to suffer in order to build character. Now, the question then becomes why one would overpower the other, and that's just a directly competing incentive claim. And that's where our first order characterization should be solving this. We should be saying, okay, this narrative is communicated by a bunch of people who want to be able to help the traumatized. It's often the traumatized themselves who are talking about these types of issues. People who are deeply afflicted by issues of violence, for instance, people who have been affected by things like domestic violence. They want to be able to give hope to those who have gone through an experience of suffering, because otherwise it often feels like your life is hopeless and that your life has been forever scarred by the bad experience that you've had. And so we would say that because these are the groups of people who are communicating it, they're likely to be particularly empathetic toward the receivers of the narrative being those who had previously experienced such things. And so would tailor it toward the idea that you can give hope to those who have experienced suffering, and not instead saying that this is a prerequisite to you having a life where you are a strong person. So that's just like directly solving it. That's not what we're talking about, right? I think what we should be talking about instead is if there's different potential valid characterizations, how do we solve between the two? So for example, let's go back to that same instance. Let's say that prop is going to say that the people who say that suffering is character building for positive reasons are because these are people who are empathetic, who are trying to reach out to the traumatized. The other side might say that those people who are trying to say that suffering is a prerequisite to character building are also such people. They're also people who have been traumatized, but who haven't received the same level of support, who haven't maybe had that level of outreach to them. As such, they want to gatekeep. They see their identity heavily tied up in the idea that they have suffered, and they want to believe that that is something important to them. So they gatekeep. They say that it's important to your ability to be somebody who's whole, or for your ability to be somebody who's strong, for you to have built yourself through the crucible of having suffered. So you can then ask the important question of, given that these are two potential different, pretty realistic ways that things might happen, there would be groups of traumatized people who want to reach out with empathy. But then there are also those who want to reach out by empowering themselves by gatekeeping. Which of these then is like the dominant characterization? Which of these is more important? Which of these is more dominant? That kind of thing. And similarly, like competing contexts of emotion more generally. Because the example I just gave is one of like where basically the same issue is being debated from both sides. But there's obviously context claims, right? Like when I was talking earlier about the instance of, like when I was talking earlier about this instance of the Vienna Round 2 motion, the motion about people who are elected representatives being the exclusive pool from which we pull for cabinet positions. Now, in that motion, Obviously, there's one set of contexts where it's very democratic governments, and we try to think about what difference does this make to just the way in which they get people's like bigger policy directions determined. How do we determine transport policy, etc.? And do we need people who are technocrats, or should we have people who are elected? But then also there's the other side's vision of this is a debate about places that are heavily corrupt and avoiding the worst case instances of heavy patronage. Now, in that case, we would need to resolve between which of these is the dominant or more important set of bigger situation in which the motion is operating. So how is it that we might want to go about trying to resolve between those characterizations? I think that there's three potential ways that we can try to answer for that. And I'll try to go through each of them in order to try to explain exactly how it is that we would go about trying to land that claim and trying to land that explanation. I also should probably grab a charger real quick, which is also what I was trying to do on the side because my laptop is on the verge of death. Always fun to have a lecture with a few intermissions. Yeah, let's charge it now. Okay, great. Yeah. So how is it that we would go about resolving it? I want to use this motion as our analogy motion for this, which is this house would raise their child to prefer to be single, which is it's a motion that's been set a time. It's a good motion. Now, there's three different ways we can go about the resolution of this clash. The first one is to say that one of these contexts is more dominant than the other context. So therefore, we should care about it more. So let's take an example of this from this motion. We could say on prop. The reason you should raise your child to prefer to be single is because in most situations, kids will develop bad expectations and latch their self-worth to those bad expectations. And this is the dominant set of situations because kids, teenagers have very fragile self-esteem. They want to be valued and loved, and they haven't really built a robust sense of self yet. So it's very hard to like yourself very much when you don't know who you are. You often value external social validation a lot. You value what your friends think of you. You value being thought of as attractive or beautiful. You value being thought about as popular and well-liked. So your self-esteem matters to you quite a bit, right? And as a result of that, it is very easy for you to be able to latch your self-worth to the idea that you would be in a relationship. So the set of contexts in which you develop bad expectations and a lack of self-worth as a result of the pursuit of relationships is the dominant set of characterizations. There's some kids who will be immune to that. There's some kids who learn well from their parents that they shouldn't latch themselves to that thing, but those are fewer and further between. The dominant set of ways in which kids' calculus in their brains work is this one, and so that's why we should care about this more. The second thing we can do is we can say that one of these contexts is more impactful than the other. So let's go same motion, prop again. We could, for instance, say that some kids are really horrible to other kids. And in relationship context, that would be particularly pervasive. Trigger warning, of course, for bad things that people do in relationships. We could say that in school situations, you see like body shaming, you see revenge porn, you see these type of things being used all the time when kids have phones and kids are poorly intentioned. So even if in most cases, this is not going to happen, in the cases where it does, these kids can potentially get traumatized and develop long-term trust issues in being able to build a relationship. They can be like the experience of having that happen to you can be really, really horrifying for you. So what we can say is that even if that's a minority of instances, that it is such an important set of circumstances that we ought guard against it because of how impactful it is. The last set of things I wanted to mention here is like that one side or one context has particularly harmful permutations that ought to be avoided, or that it can manifest in such a way that it is not good, even if that's not the dominant set. I want to use a different motion for this. Let's take the motion, like I think that often this applies to like any motion about research. Where we're making arguments about research, we oftentimes just assume that the difference is just like more research versus less research. But sometimes it's actually about getting a completely different version of that thing. Are we getting more good, helpful research that is helping us cure cancer? Or are we getting more research that is just like book reviews or article reviews? So clearly just like more research equals good is not something that we can take for granted. And so sometimes we're just getting a different kind of that thing. And we can argue that we get a different type of something that we ought to avoid instead as a way to be able to argue our way around why one set of contexts ought to be more important than another. And this is how we should often try to go about building a nuanced characterization, to say that their world obviously does exist, This is why our world, or the situations that we're talking about, is a more important or dominant set of them, or that it leads to some effect that we would like to preferably avoid. Next, let's talk about some of the methods to do for characterization, of just like how is it that you go about the process of explanation. The first thing to consider is just like storytelling and illustration, which I think are really underrated tools where it comes to trying to land characterization. And you might notice that I've been trying to incorporate this over the course of all the examples that we've been doing, of trying to illustrate them out in such a way that's very easy to get wrapped into the narrative of what's being talked about. And you can buy into this just being the way that the world is. So I think that essentially a lot of time when we want to illustrate to characterize is to make sure that we ground things and make them seem realistic. For instance, this might be in a case where an argument might otherwise seem unrealistic, like claiming that a small scale thing has a very big effect. Let's take a claim that might seem trivial until it's explained on its magnitude, like saying that we're slowing down manufacturing supply chains in China. We might say, okay, sure, we're slowing them down slightly. What does that matter? But then to answer that, we might say, the conditions in which we slow down manufacturing supply chains are ones in which eventually people will want stuff that is not being produced off the supply line fast enough. When people want things more and faster than those things are being produced, that then leads to a level of inflation because people's demand for that thing is outstripping supply, and a logjam and a slowdown is leading to the fact that people can't get things as fast as they want. And that inflation is really impactful. It means that people can't afford things that would otherwise be very important to them. Even if that's if that's technological products and semiconductors, it means that things like laptops that are going to be able to send people to school might end up becoming out of their reach for those who are poor and middle class and who are trying to attain those things for the sake of their kids' futures. Or it might be the case that for those who are trying to, it might be the case that if a small business can't afford additional electronics, then they end up not being able to sell as many products and they end up having to lay off workers. So we can see that being able to build out that claim with illustration just has this small, trivial seeming thing can actually have rather important impacts. Or let's, for instance, take this motion of this house believes that democratic states should run media organizations. And let's take the claim on that opposition might make that if the government owns or runs its own media organizations, they'll manipulate it in its favor. Now that seems kind of unrealistic as a characterization. That seems like it's kind of outlandish, or it seems kind of extreme. But when we illustrate that and we tell the story of it, I think, in a compelling way, then we can make it sound way more realistic and way more plausible. So what would I say on that? I would say, how is it that a democratic government would be able to manipulate media in their favor? You can cherry pick information and the sources that you use to be ones that favor your narrative. You never outright lie, but you selectively pick all of the facts and information that is best for you and your agenda and narrative, and ignore the ones that are contrary to your agenda and narrative. It is the issues that you choose to cover, highlighting the issues on which your electoral campaign is very contingent to be very big picture issues for the country, and ignoring ones on which the other parties are doing a better job than you are. It's the language of headlines and articles. Do you phrase things in ways that are supportive to one side or another? There's significant narrative control power that comes from your ability to influence the words that are said. So you can see there that storytelling and illustration helps for us to land characterization within the claims that we're making, and for us to be able to tell a story of something in such a way that makes it go from sounding unrealistic to making it sound not just deeply plausible, but indeed somewhat likely. The second approach that I like is one that I would call this constraint parameter approach. Essentially, what this approach consists of is taking an argument and you go, here are some reasons why something would happen. Here are some reasons why something would not happen. The question is then, why are the reasons in favor overpowering the reasons against? Now, I would note that this is an approach that mostly works best on arguments that are on the softer side, but you can also work with like incentive arguments to do with like a company, or incentive arguments to do with like a country. They basically just rely on there being heavily incentive-based arguments that are very tied to one specific actor. In these, I think this can be a very, very useful approach to take because it makes you sound very intellectually honest, as well as then being able to address issues head on. So the steps are that you would set up the question between what the two different competing variables are, then you answer it with weighing for why reasons for one side would overpower the other. I'm going to try to talk through this with the example from this motion from the LSE Open this year. This House regrets the resurgence of conservative attitudes towards sex and marriage amongst Gen Z. So for example, more pro-marriage ideals and being against casual sex or one-night stands. So what we might say from the start is that like the context here is that liberal norms around marriage and liberal norms around sexual relationships are things that generally tend towards people's moral priors to some degree. There's religious narratives in our lives that tell us that marriage is sacred and that we should aim for it. There's movies and pop cultures that are decades long that teach us that love and relationships are about finding the one. There are parents who will judge us if they see us as promiscuous. These are obviously things that we're taught from a very young age. So the question then becomes, there's this set of narratives amongst young people, obviously, that promote casual sex, right? That say that you're cool if you have casual sex and that kind of thing. And that you would enjoy it very much and that exploration is very good for you. There's also this set of narratives that say that you shouldn't do this and that you should be more constrained and that type of thing, and these more conservative attitudes. So the question then is, why is it that our priors overpower these more contemporary narratives such that we need these more liberal attitudes as a counterbalancing force? And then we can answer that with mechanisms that weigh between these two things. Firstly, it might be the length of exposure. So a narrative kicks in and affects us when it forms a part of our value system and the things that we think make us a good or a bad person or a cool or an uncool person. Because we've been exposed to narratives that come from our parents and from religious and social forces for longer, they have a greater effect on us. We have a greater set of reference experiences of what we think is right and wrong, instances of what our friends have done, instances of what our relatives have done, that we then use to inform our own moral value judgments that would be more well-formed with the narrative that we've been accustomed to for a longer period of time. But secondly, it might be a validation. Sure, we care about the things that our friends say, but our friends are people in university who we probably met relatively recently, versus our parents are people who are always around and people who are tied to much more. So we can see both of those things are weighing reasons for why one set of incentives will overpower the other. And so that is why we need an enabling attitude, because the status quo bias is one that goes against liberal attitudes, and that's why we should regret the motion. So you can see there that we're being quite honest in the setup, that there's some reasons why this narrative is going to have an effect on people. There's some reasons why a counterbalancing narrative has an effect on people. Why does one overpower the other? And then we answer that question in such a way that then makes our context very, very relevant, and it makes it the dominant context. So we can see that this constraint-based approach can be very helpful. Similarly, it can be much simpler than this, right? We can say, for example, like, let's take the motion like this house regrets the rise of online journalism. And you're going to make the argument that journalists are sensationalists online. You might say, okay, there's some incentives for journalists to be sensationalists, which is to say that they want to get lots of clicks, they want to get trending on the internet. There's some reasons to not do that, which is to say that you want to preserve integrity and trust in the things that you read. So why is it that then the incentives to be sensationalist will overpower the incentives for you to be trustworthy and stable? Because you have to be competitive. Other news outlets are taking the sensationalist approach. So if you don't, you're going to be left behind and you are going to become irrelevant. And even if in actuality, your competitors are doing that. So even if you're The Economist and actually The Atlantic isn't taking that approach, you are worried and fearful that they might. And so out of risk aversion, you take this approach anyway. So you can see that makes for a much more nuanced answer to be able to characterize why it is that a certain reaction will happen. And it helps for us to characterize our way into setting up a really robust parameter for why our argument would be true. The last thing to note, I would say, is that we need to make sure that we are identifying acutely the group of people who we're talking about. And oftentimes it will be useful to split them up into different groups. So let's again go back to this this motion about this house regrets the resurgence of conservative attitudes towards sex and marriage. We might say, okay, there's different groups of young people that this motion involves. Firstly, there are those young people who are relatively conservative. They're probably not going to be affected on either side of the house because their attitudes are not a result of this resurgence. They might try to convince other people, maybe they'll be somewhat successful. On the other end of it, there's groups of people who are reliant on the liberal norm. That is to say, these are like, for example, queer people or people who want to be polyamorous. These people are heavily reliant on this more liberal norm. And that is important because then this resurgence of conservative attitudes heavily harms them It harms the number of people who would be accepting toward them, as well as the number of people who they would be able to explore their identities with and the ability for them to feel safe. And then the third group is the group of people in the middle, everybody else. These are the people who would be most affected by the narrative, because they're the people who are amenable to being convinced either way, who have somewhat like some conservative priors, but are open to thinking, for example, that sleeping around is fine, even if they're not going to try polyamory, but are also open to thinking that they should try to date to find the one. And they'll probably go back and forth between the two as they grow up. And so these are the groups of people on whom the narrative will have a very heavy effect to change their behaviors. So we can see that by splitting up different groups within the bigger group of people who are affected by the motion, we can do much more acute characterization and impacting for precisely how the motion is going to affect them and precisely what degree of effect it might end up having on them. We might, so for example, on the group of people who are, like, for example, more reliant on the liberal norms, like queer people, they're going to be a smaller group, but one who is more heavily reliant on the motion and so will be more intensely impacted. But for the group of people who are the majority, they are the dominant case of the motion on whom you can probably show the biggest comparative difference, the biggest margin of change. The last thing I want to address is about responsive characterization, which I think is the last thing to consider when it comes to characterization, which is just like, how do we deal with other teams and the way in which they characterize? I think there's a couple of approaches that we can take. And for this, I want to go to this motion. This opposes the norm of founders staying in key C-suite positions post-IPO. So for example, this would be Steve Jobs staying on as the CEO of Apple even after Apple goes public. Or for example, the same being true for Elon Musk or the same being true for Mark Zuckerberg. So the first thing we would want to consider doing in order to dispute another team's characterization is to out-illustrate them. Well, sorry, to be clear, I did want to say that, like, I think that we've already established that, like, the dominant best way to be able to dispute another team's characterization is some of the weighing methods that we talked about earlier, trying to demonstrate that your set of situations is, like, more dominant than theirs, that it's more marginally impactful / comparative than theirs, or trying to say that it's more impactful on this group of people who will affect, even if it's a more acute impact. But outside of those, these are some other responsive approaches. The first thing you can do is to try to out-illustrate the other side. The first way you can try to do this is to try to do illustrations that will cast doubt on believing their characterization. So if you're on, if you're on prop, for example, you can be there in second and you could say, is Elon Musk really driving innovations at Tesla, or is he spending his time messing around at the White House? This is probably a bad example because this is like the most extreme example of like where it would be bad for a key C-suite founder to stay around. But we could do a more ideal one as well. We could say, is Sam Altman's single-headed drive on OpenAI of trying to make sure that you make AI maximally efficacious rather than trying to have a more restrictive and regulated approach toward AI growth, is this good? Or is it actually preferable for us to have a board who's going to be more risk averse and is less technical, so will be less invested in the technical advancement of artificial intelligence? So you can see that this is doing is it's giving illustrations that just cast doubt on the idea that there are actually net positive effects of their side. But the other thing we can do for illustrations is to try to do illustration that shows your side as the majority case. And the best approach for this, I think, is to just try to do like 3 or 4 examples strung together in order to try to really show credibility and be able to demonstrate that this is the dominant norm and not the minority case. So you might say, like, for example, Disney was so heavily dependent on Bob Iger that even after he resigned, they managed to bring him back because they didn't know how they were going to run the company without him. Sam Altman was brought back after being ousted by Microsoft for OpenAI because the stock price was so clearly tied to him and the stock price dipped so massively after Sam Altman left. If Adam Neumann had stepped back from WeWork, he wouldn't have been so pivotal to the business that no one else could do his job and that he was left in a position where he had unchecked power and could spend shareholder money without constraint. All of this together shows you that in the majority of instances, even if in some situations these founders have good ideas, even in some situations the founders have positive influences, in the majority of instances they have a net negative effect on their company. So what opposition needs to show you is why the positive understandings, like the slightly greater knowledge and understanding of the business that Sam Altman has compared to the new technocratic CEO that would be appointed by a board of directors is that much more important than the unchecked norm, than the unchecked power and the unchecked dominance that a founder is able to have over a company once it goes public and it's exposed to the public markets. So you can see that stringing together those 3 or 4 illustrations and trying to then push this as being, this is the dominant norm, not their side. And so they need to contend with this being the dominant set of cases, is able to do a lot to be able to push the comparative against another team and to be able to out-illustrate them by being able to try to show them as marginal. The other thing we can do is we can try to attack the underlying conditions of the other side's characterization. So, for example, on the op on this motion, if we're responding to that, we can say, essentially what we're saying, what the other side is saying, is that the business needs these people. A business, what it needs is effective leadership and understanding of its fundamentals. That is what its CEO needs so that they're able to get the best out of the company and they don't lead its direction astray. So on prop, if we can show you that we can externally get people who have this good understanding of the business and its fundamentals and have a good smooth transition so that it isn't a sudden shock, that shows you that the underlying premise that only the founders have that level of knowledge and understanding is a false premise. And instead, we're able to show you that getting in new, fresher faces does more good than it does harm, and it avoids a lot of the harm that their side creates. So by identifying what the underlying conditions of their characterization are, as in what is it that they seem to rely on and think is so important about the way in which founders are unique, we're able to then dispute that characterization and be able to just challenge it on its truth value without even needing to weigh against it more directly or to even like have to basically take that set of context particularly seriously. I obviously think you should do this in a charitable way, in a way where you recognize that there's obviously some truth to their side, because if there wasn't, then the motion wouldn't be balanced, which sometimes it isn't, but like in the instance where it is. But I would suggest that you should try to do it in a way that chips away at credibility and undermines what are the conditions of truth value for their side to be able to then show why it's hard for you to believe their characterization, even if there's some intuitive value to it. So that's the way I would approach responding on characterization as well, other than the stuff that you already mentioned. I think, ignoring all of the practical advice that we've had about different approaches.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so should we prioritize doing framing before making an argument, or should we implement those framing inside an argument, or should we do both at the same time, depending on the motion, depending on the burden of the argument?
Well, yeah, I think it would be probably way closer to the last option, right? What you would want to be doing is you would want to be setting up an argument within a certain context that is just the context under which the argument is operating. And then at different points, different characterization burdens are relevant to different parts of the argument, like with the example that we went through. And then you would want to be characterizing things as they become relevant. This is, again, why I say that the burden-related approach is probably the best one to take, because otherwise it can be very confusing as to like, oh, do I put a lot of this framing right at the start and then just go into impact? Whereas if you set them out as just like, here are the burdens for the argument to be true, then it becomes way, way clearer, just like how characterization will tie into each individual step of the argument. And then you won't need to, and then you can split it up in a way that's much more linear and much easier to follow.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
Great. All right. So just the last thing I wanted to just top out with is, I think that if you take away one thing from this, it is don't ignore or run away from the fact that you need to characterize. Because if not, other teams are going to mobilize the fact that you didn't against you. And it just undermines the persuasiveness of what you're saying quite a lot. It means you're arguing in a vacuum, or that if you're not arguing in a vacuum, you're not getting the best value out of the things that you are saying. So I really think that it benefits you quite a lot to be able to land a claim by being able to demonstrate the context in which it operates. It makes for much more robust and much more nuanced arguments. And so I would heavily, heavily encourage you to try to implement some of the constructive things that we talked about in order to try to make the process of characterizing stuff way stronger in your debating. I hope that makes sense. I know that was a lot of throwing material at you guys. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions that people have, clarify any things, talk about round situations, anything else that people might want help with.
May I ask a question? Am I
Yeah,
audible
sure,
to
hit
you?
me. Yeah, we can hear you.
It's about basically running a vertical extension through. It's like when opening government basically basically almost illustrates what the actor's incentive is, and basically relies on that they throw the argument. I am from closing government, try to basically winning the particular achievement, winning the particular goal through specifically illustrates how basically the actors achieve the particular thing, only do the certain way. So what are the constructive characterization tips I can utilize? Can you basically give me some sort of case study or like
So
something
I think the
that?
best, I think the best thing to consider here is what we were talking about, where it comes to basically going beyond first order characterization and going into a little bit more depth. Because I think the situation you're describing is one that often happens, right? Where like OG goes and says, here's the way in which certain people will behave, but they don't explain what that means in the context of the variety of decisions that might be available. So let's go back to, for example, the instance from that motion about this House regrets the rise in conservative dating norms. So what we might say is, like, let's say opening government comes up and they say something along the lines of younger people, like, this is really important because younger people need a narrative that empowers them to be able to explore what they want in dating, explore what they want in their sex lives, and not just get tied down to one relationship. Fair point. But the question left within that is, why is it that that because of this resurgence, that they wouldn't be able to do it? Why is it that these things can't coexist? So what you might say out of CG is, opening government rightly identified that people would benefit from a narrative that enables for them to be more sexually liberal. However, they don't really explain why these things would be conflicting with one another, why both of them can't simultaneously exist. And clearly here, what opposition saying is valid as well, which is that there's benefit to there being conservative forces as well. They can be a checking mechanism against the liberal stories. So then the question becomes, why is it that we need to not have the conservative norms there in order to enable for liberal attitudes to prevail? And then the answer is in the characterization that we were talking about earlier, where we say that people have relatively conservative trending priors. And so the existence of this narrative in line with their priors will overpower and shut out any more liberal norms. And so that is why we need to keep it, because these narratives can't coexist. They will instead crowd each other out. And then I think you would probably just want to label at the bottom of that exactly what that means for how you evaluate the round and really spell it out to a judge. To be like, look, in absence of OG explaining this, OO seems to be beating that, because it seems to be true that these things could coexist, and so there isn't actually a trade-off. So the harm that's actually happening on OG is quite minimal. We are adding the analysis that goes from showing you that there's no real harm or no real trade-off to showing why there is a really significant trade-off, and one that deeply harms the ability of people who benefit from these liberal norms to be able to actually get and derive that benefit from them, to get the validation that makes them feel as if they can sexually explore, to be able to experiment with polyamory, to be able to get over the line and actually believe that that's something that they could try and do for themselves. So you can see there that what we're basically doing is we're identifying how far has the opening team gone in terms of their sort of first order claim. What is the constraint on believing that claim? We're solving the constraint. And then we are talking through why it is that in absence of that constraint being solved, you cannot fully believe the argument as given or the impacts as they were given by that team. Does that make sense?
Yeah, got your point. Thanks a lot.
Great, no worries, no worries. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer anything.
How as a debater on our like free time, for example, how can we like practice in implementing or ingraining this characterization habits into our own minds that we can characterize at this level in the blink of second during debate?
So I think there's two things to consider here. The first one is, how do we get better at it in debate contexts? To which I think the answer is practicing doing it more. Because much like with any debate related skill, like with coming up with mechanisms or like just coming up with like titles of arguments, the more that we practice it, the more that we do it, the better that we'll be able to become at just coming up with them at speed. because like, you just develop the mental muscle a bit more, right? So I think that that's the first thing to consider. There's like practicing it more in your preps, integrating it into your routine of prep, because then that will help for you to get faster at it the more that you do it, even if it'll be uncomfortable and slow at first. The second thing about like, how do you do this in your day-to-day life? I think it's worth just like when you are reading news stories and when you're thinking generally about decision calculuses, to have that mindset of like, why is it that people are acting the way they are? What are the decision calculuses that they're going through? So like, if I'm, for example, gonna think about like, I'm in class earlier today and I'm like reading about shareholder issues. And it's like, okay, there's a situation where a bank is not willing to grant security to a company. And you might say, okay, what is the decision calculus here? There's some reasons that this bank would want to do that, grant security to that company. It enables for them to grow off of the loan that they've gotten. That's basically the big reason. There's also reasons that they wouldn't. They're scared that they lose their money. So what's happening here is that their fear of losing their money is overpowering their desire to secure growth off of the loan. Or, maybe if you're in like a philosophy class and you're like, okay, why is it that like philosophy is probably a bad example actually for this. Maybe you're in like a politics class and you're talking about voting behavior and you're like, okay, why is it that in the why is it then like the UK elections in 2015 people still voted conservative in spite of austerity? It's because sure, there were benefits to them voting for something that like for the Conservative Party, that they felt trust in them. There were harms in that it would induce further austerity that would make their lives worse. But they thought that the opposition was so uncredible that they would rather take a risk on something that might make their lives worse than to do something that they thought would certainly make their lives worse. So trying to think through these kinds of decision calculuses just generally when how we encounter them in life can be useful as well. So, when we're reading news stories, thinking about that kind of thing as well would help, I think, trying to build out the mental muscle of thinking about things in that way and to be able to then apply it to debate rounds and to other contexts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks.
No worries. Any other questions? We'll probably take a couple more.
So, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question, just like a follow-up question to, I think, the previous question that Xavier asked concerning the approach that we would use, whether we sort of characterize first or um, do the argument first or do a bit of both. So, in terms of like doing both of them, right, I want to ask, so what happens where in emotion we have like different or more than one problem, right? Do we like decide on, or do we decide to like engage the problem that is the most contentious in the round, or do we utilize the different problems that exist in that motion to like flesh out different arguments?
So I think so. Obviously, it depends motion to motion a little bit, which is why it's hard to give a bit of a sweeping approach. But what I will say is, I think that in BP, you're kind of forced to make a lot of strategic trade-off calls, where it's like you probably only have time to really focus on one of these problems in a lot of depth and be able to win on it. So what I would say is it's worth asking yourself the question of, if there are two operative problems in a motion, which one feels more important? Which one feels more contentious? Which is why I think it's good that you pointed out, like, considering them based off of how contentious they are. Because if it's the case that one of them is going to be heavily pushed by the other side, being able to win on that is going to be like the clearest cut win for your side possible. And so it seems to make more sense to orient your speech and your strategy around addressing that one problem, as opposed to trying to address both piecemeal. So I think it's fair to say that you should address issues based on how competitive they are, and how contested they are, and whether or not you think that that will be the biggest issue in the round. Sometimes there will be situations where there's like multiple problems that you can try to tackle with two different arguments. But I do always think from a strategic perspective that, look, usually there's one thing that matters more than the other, or that it's easier to, or like rather it's easier to justify that it would matter more than the other. And so it's way easier to run that and weigh it than there is for you to try to run two things to absolute completion and end up with one kind of incomplete. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, it does. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. We'll probably take one more question.
Can I?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
All right. So think about those scenarios where like you are in the closing and your say opening did give some characterizations, but in prep time you have found out that there is like one piece of characterization that is not so related to opening that you can just simply call it an extension, but giving that characterization would open an avenue for you to win the debate much clearly than it would to like basically incline to the characterization that came from opening. So what do you do in those scenarios? Do you like go with your piece of characterization and kind of forego the characterizations that came from opening, or do you don't do that because that might be a bad call?
I mean, it really does depend round to round for this one again, but obviously like a characterization driven extension can often be a good idea, because what it does for you is it helps for you to just try to argue that like the motion is about something entirely different and to try to push that is a more relevant or important set of contexts. Now, obviously, you're inhibited there by two different things. Number one, that your opening will have their pick of the pie, right? So they're going to be able to take what seems to be the more obviously good and obviously relevant characterization. So they have that in their favor. That's good for them. So that's one thing. That means that's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is that like you need to be sure that like it entirely logically holds that this is also a relevant context in the round, because sometimes if opening doesn't take it or touch it, it might be one where there are difficult or contentious burdens to prove to think about. So what does that mean? I think it means that in prep time, you need to be thinking about, firstly, what are all of the necessary steps or burdens for this argument to work, such that you aren't caught off guard by any really challenging part of that context. But secondly, you need to be thinking about a reason, not just why this context is an important context, but why this is a more important context than the obvious set of situations in which the motion manifests. Because that is what you need to contend against, right? You need to contend against why it matters more than the obvious, like low-hanging fruit context in which the motion manifests. Because if not, then your argument could be entirely true, and opening would win because, like, sure, you're not derivative, you're novel, but what they're saying just seems to be more important. It just seems to matter more. And so if you're going to try to do that context-based extension, those are the two things to consider. Number one, are there any sort of important burdens or difficult components of that argument to prove that are really important for you to think about and to have developed some kind of answer for in advance? And secondly, where it comes to the where it comes to proving it, why is it that this context is one that is more valuable or more important in some way than just like the intuitive low-hanging fruit characterization that works in favor of the obvious argument that prop would run in this motion? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Great, no worries at all. All right, I think that we can probably wrap it there then. Thank you so much, guys. It was delightful to be able to come in. Happy to answer all your questions. And I think that you would be able to communicate others of them over to Umar and the Uhuru team if you want to push more of them along. I'm happy to address some of them out, some other ones at